So I think we can start. And first of all, let me remind you about the schedule as usual. Okay. Today we are here. We are talking about React state, very important topic. I mean, not so difficult, but you need to get used to it. And you will for sure use the state in your final submission for the exam, because the state is the place where we put the information that comes from the server. Let's say it in a very few words, okay? Plus other information that might be needed by the application and so on. But anyway, that's the schedule for next week. So next week is similar to this one. My lecture on Monday and Thursday, and lab on Tuesday, okay? So you already have it, and I will soon publish the slides. But by the way, not so different from last year, okay? I'll just make sure the React router is the latest version and this kind of things, and that's why I wait until a few days before the lecture to publish them, okay? To make sure we have the latest version and so on. Okay, so let's talk about state. If you have any questions, just feel free to ask me. Okay, so we are in React, and we need to understand how React can manage this state. And first of all, what is this state and why we need this state? Okay, so until now we saw components in React, and components are just pure function. Remember, they take props and they return a value, and this value is the UE fragment, or the user interface fragment, the JSX. We wrote some JSX that is basically HTML with the possibility to include some JavaScript extension inside it. But to do something more advanced, we need something more they are called hooks in React. Okay, hooks is just this stuff. Okay, so pure functions have a lot of advantages, but also limitations. Right? Pure function means we pass something as a parameter, and we know that every time we pass the same parameters, we get the same result, okay? Idempotent and so on. And so they cannot have a state, so they cannot remember information, okay? If we need to remember information, we need an additional mechanism, and we will see what React provides us, okay? We will not manage this information by ourselves, but we need to tell React where is this information and so on. Why? Because we want React to manage the user interface. So when some information changes, we want to notify React and let React update the user interface. That's why we want React handling the state for us. So additional information outside these props, okay? And there are no side effects and so on, because we say they should be pure function, idempotent, and so they cannot use information stored outside the props, okay? Okay, may define handle function, but we will see this later, okay? Without a state, it's not so useful. And so what's the way of including a state, so this information stored and managed by React in React components? Well, historically, there were two ways. One were the functional, in the class components. Okay, we're not going to see them anymore, because also nobody is using it anymore. They are more complex. They require this object-oriented programming mentality. Require the class function in JavaScript. They have issues with the binding the this and so on. So a lot of complicated things that have been, I would say, superseded or deprecated in React. So we're not going to see that approach that was popular like 5 years ago or more. And nowadays there is a much more intuitive and even less complex mechanism that is called hooks. These hooks have been proposed in October 2018, so 6 years ago, more or less, a bit less. And actually, at that time, it was just a proposal, but nowadays it's the way in which everybody programs in React. So everybody's using hooks, even custom-defined hooks, and so on. Okay, because over the time, developers realized that this paradigm was very powerful and simple to understand, simple to use mechanism, and so basically everybody nowadays uses hooks. And we will do the same. Okay. So actually hooks are a way to add some mechanism, functionality to function components, so the pure function we saw last time, to access advanced features in a controlled way. Okay, so hooks are, basic hooks are defined by the React library. So the React library takes control about what we want to do with these hooks. Okay, in particular today we are going to see one important hook, that is the one that is able to manage a state, so to remember some information inside our client application. And then there are hooks to do other things, like I said, side effects in particular, that allows us to load information from the server and so on. Okay? There is one hook call for each requested functionality. So basically there is one hook for state, one hook for context, one hook for the side effects, and so on. Hooks are just functions, okay, normal functions. They have been just defined not by ourselves, but by React. So we find these functions in React, and we import these functions from React, as we import all the rest of the stuff from React when we need it. Okay? As we import the React fragment, React element, and so on. Okay? Good. So these are the three most popular hooks: use state, use effect, and use context. We will spend a lot of time on these hooks, especially the first two. Today, the use state. Next time, use context, and then we will talk about routers and so on. And then we'll spend more than 3 hours on the use effect, which is very, very important hook. Okay, to handle side effects that allows us basically to communicate with the server. And then there is plenty of other hooks that I invite you not to use. Okay, don't use them, especially at exam, just for your safety. It's not really forbidden. It's something that actually we don't need. So if you actually use them for the exam, you will be questioned for sure about them, why you use it, okay? There's no need to use them in our simple applications. Since our applications are quite simple, we have no need to use these hooks, which are mostly, I would say, more than half of them for optimization purposes, optimizing performance and so on. And by the way, some of the things here are already handled automatically by React. So there are actually no need to use these hooks, and if you use them, you will be questioned for sure, okay? Because there is actually no reason to use them. And why are you questioned? Because, we fear, in a certain sense, that the AI has done the coding for you, right? And we don't like it. You are here to learn how to code. And we know that these AI tools can do a lot of things. We are not against them, but you need to understand what they are doing, okay? Being able to debug and explain what they are doing, okay? That's what is, by the way, also quite requested as a job today, right? Monitor what the AI is doing. And if you don't know what is happening in your application, of course, the result is failing the exam, okay? So, this is the only slide where you will see these hooks, okay? Just the name, okay? But if you arrive at the exam with these hooks, I will ask you, why did you use it? What is this hook doing? And what is the parameter? What is the return value? Why does it fit in your submission? Why did you need it? Could you avoid using it? What's the difference if you avoid using it? And so on, okay? Because we actually don't need them. Okay, good. So, given this warning, let's have a look at the use state, okay? So, in particular, the state, okay? And so this is just a schema that shows you how a generic component is supposed to work, right? This is a React component, so that pure function that we defined last time, and we will define other functions today. Carrying on with the example, question and answer that we usually develop during the lectures. And we know that the React component is called using props as parameters. So it's an input to the React component, and it gives a result, this element 3. You remember the JSX, return with some JSX, and this JSX is the HTML, basically, okay, that can contain more complex thing than HTML tags, so other components and so on, and React, let's say, recursively calls the function corresponding to the React component and then arrives at a representation that only includes HTML elements. Okay? It creates the virtual DOM, it does the difference with the previous virtual DOM, and then it updates the actual user interface, modifying the actual DOM in the browser. Okay? In this elementary, you can have other child components. Okay, so if you use another component defined either by you or by library, like React Bootstrap and so on, you pass props to these components, and this component works as the previous one, okay, until you reach the leaves of the tree, right? Okay, good. So that's what we saw until now. Component gets props. But today, we will see the component can also access some state in a controlled way. So we need to tell React, we want to use a state in this component, okay? And the difference between props and state is that in the state, we can set information, so remember information, okay, from the code of the React component. So we have a way to store information and get this information back when the code of the React component is executed again by React, of course, because the function of React component is called by React when it needs to re-render the component, okay? And then next time we will see there is another possibility to receive information not just by props, but also by context, because otherwise you need to pass props along the tree, and sometimes it might be a little bit inconvenient, okay? But context can be seen as like an advanced way of passing props through the, in a faster way through the element tree, okay? And you can also set something, but that's not actually the purpose of the context, okay? The context basically allows you to get functions that then you can call, but we will talk about context later on in the course. So today we are going to focus on the state, and especially we are going to get this feature in addition, so the possibility to set information from the component inside the state and have the state remember this information. Okay, so we said props. Props are immutable, right? They are a JavaScript object. We know we can modify any object in JavaScript. That's true. But from the point of view of the React application and the React philosophy, actually, we should not modify props. It's useless, okay? Because props are just passed to us, and React doesn't care about what we do with the props, okay? And so that's also why they are supposed to be immutable, because modifying them leads to nowhere. State, instead, is a place where a component can hold data locally, okay? That means that state, so that those values are local and private in a certain sense to that component. When the state changes, usually the component needs to be re-rendered. It means if the value has changed, React will detect the fact that the value has changed and will trigger a re-render of the component, and in turn of all the rest of the application that depends on that state. Okay? If that state is passed as props to other components, it will re-render the other components as well. So the state is private to the component, and it's mutable from inside the component only from the inside of the component. So it means that we get, we will see the code. We have a function that gives us the value and the value of the state, and also a function to modify that state. And it's mandatory to use this function to modify the state. And this function is available only to the component that created the state. Okay, it's not available to all the others or the children and so on. Not automatically, at least. We can then pass it along, and we will see examples. And instead, the context is a sort of global and implicit props automatically passed to all interested components, but more details later in another block of slides. We saw the schedule, right? I think next Thursday we will talk about context. Okay? Okay, so let's come back to the state. How how do we define a state in React according to the React philosophy? Well, actually, we need to use the useState hook. Okay, hook is just a word in the React jargon. So it's just a word that React uses to classify some special function that give to the developer to achieve certain functionalities. Okay, and so actually useState is the name of the function given by React to create the states. Okay, so let's see an example. Very simple example, the simplest example we can create. Okay, we already saw something in the boilerplate code that was created by Vite, because it actually used a very simple state. You remember the count? There was a button with a count and so on. And actually, that's the same sort of code. Here is even more simple because the state is just a binary state. Anyway, useState. useState is a function that needs to be imported from the React library. Okay, React library useState allows us to define a state inside a function component. How do you use it? You just call it. You call it with an initial value, and then we will have a more formal description in a minute. But anyway, intuitively, you need to have an initial value of the state, and then you need to get the current value of the state. And also, as I told you, React wants to be notified when you want to change the state. You cannot change the state directly, so it returns also a function that you can call when you want to modify the state. Okay? And you will call this function to modify the state typically in two cases. One is depending on what's happening in the user interface. So the user triggers some events, like click on a button, moves the mouse, submit a form, whatever. Or you get some information from the server. Okay? We have no possibility to get information from the server for the moment, so just think in terms of the first case. So user does something in the user interface, like it clicks on a button, and we attach an event handler to this click, and there we can call the function to modify the state. Okay? And that's all for the developer. And then React, if the state has been modified, is in charge to change the user interface, update the user interface according to the new value of the state and the props that might have been modified by this event. Okay? So, okay, so let's have a look at this example, and then we will also try this example. I think we can, yeah. If not, just with copy-pasting inside the Vite example. So, so short text, this is just a component that return some JSX. You see the span. Span is a generic tag. It's sort of transparent tag. It doesn't create a block. It's not like a div. Span is an inline tag, so it allows you to identify a piece of HTML that is rendered left to right, and then on a new line if it exceeded the right margin. And inside the span, we put some text, okay? Some text that is, you see, the curly bracket, a JavaScript expression. So if it's an is true, we have props text, substring props max length. So basically we cut the string coming from the prop named text. Otherwise, so the 3 dots here are just text, okay? It's not the spread operator and so on. This is just text because it's in the quotation marks, right? And then props text is the text, the full text contained in the text variable of the props, okay? And then hidden here, again, it's a link, okay? It's a link, the anchor tag, where we have two different handlers. On-click set hidden false, or on-click set hidden true, okay? And then we render the text more or less, okay? So depending on the state, what we return as the fragment of user interface changes, okay? So it's natural that when the state changes, React has to re-render the user interface, okay? And it will do it in the same way as it does for all the components included in our application. And for this component, React knows it has a state, so it monitors the state, and when we call setHidden, it checks if the state has changed or not. If the state has changed, it calls short text again, and it gets the new return value, that is the new JSX that will be inserted in the virtual DOM, difference with the old virtual DOM, and then actually rendered and applied to the actual DOM, so it shows in the browser. Okay? So, we will try this example in a minute. Before going on, just a formal description of what the useState does. So, useState creates a new state variable, okay? And this is just a JavaScript variable, so it can contain anything. You can put a number, a boolean, a string, an object, an array, whatever you want, just valid stuff, okay? Typically, you don't put a reference to a function because in a state you want to have some values that can be used in rendering, okay? But in principle, you can even put it, okay? But not so useful. Hidden, that's a name decided by the developer with the name of the variable, and then set this name is the update function to change the value of this variable, okay? So I invite you to follow this convention, set plus the first letter uppercase, and then the rest is the same as the variable, okay? So it's much easier to identify the functions that are actually functions that modify a React state, okay? Set something. And what you pass here as a parameter is the default initial value. So at the beginning, you want to initialize the state. So in the beginning, hidden will have this value, true in this case. Typically, the type of this value is the same of the type contained in the state. But actually, again, this is JavaScript. There are just variables. You can put whatever you want, okay? But being consistent is something that helps you a lot, okay? So if you decide that the state contains a Boolean value, typically initialize it with a Boolean value and just put a Boolean value inside it, okay? React doesn't get confused, but you as a developer risk to be confused, right? So we can also create more than one state in the same component, okay? That's a really big advantage of Hooks, which by the way was not possible when we added these class components. That's also why Hooks became so popular, because it simplified programming quite a lot in this sense. And then you might remember the syntax, the square brackets, two values equal to, and this is just an array destructuring assignment to assign two values at once returned by the function, okay? So basically, with this syntax, we are actually creating two new variables, hidden and setHidden. One contains the value, and the other contains the reference to the function to be called to change the state. Okay? Actually, const is fine. Okay? Const actually it refers to the array, but anyway, it will be recreated every time you call the function component. Okay? So it's not a problem in this sense. Okay? You are not going to write hidden equal to something. That's forbidden in React. Okay? It should be written somewhere. Never modify the state variable directly. Okay, never hidden equal to something. That's wrong. Why? I mean, JavaScript is not wrong for JavaScript. It's wrong for React because React doesn't know you changed the value of the state. Okay, if you pass through the function that is supposed to change the value of the state, React also does other operations. So it checks if it's the same value as before, and so on. It triggers the render and all the stuff. That's why you need to use the set function to modify the state, and you cannot simply assign it directly. Okay? Just out of curiosity, React has this kind of approach, so we need to follow this kind of approach. Other frameworks have different approaches. Okay, maybe you know Angular. I don't know it so well, but I know that, for instance, in that case, there are some iterations just to check every state variable if it has changed or not, and so basically there you can assign values to the state, okay, directly, because at a certain point the framework checks if the value has changed. Here it does not. So React wants you to use the set function to change the state. Okay? So it creates a state variable of any type, as I said. It can be Boolean, number, string, array, object. And this value is remembered across function calls. Okay? So function calls means the calls to the function that define the component. Okay? And how does this work? We will see it at the end of the discussion about all hooks. But I mean, there's a special place in React where these hooks are kept. So there is a special memory area, let's say, managed by React where it keeps the values, okay, for the hooks, in particular the states. Okay, so we don't have to care about it. React cares about it for us. The default value sets the initial value and also the type. But type is not so strict, but I invite you to be coherent. If the initial value has some type, use the same type also when you update the state. Variable name can be used inside the function anywhere. It's just a variable of JavaScript. So you cannot assign a new value, but you can use it as you like. As we saw before, we just tested it. Hidden, question mark. So if hidden is true, then, and so on. Okay? So it can be used, it can be even passed as props for other components. This is a very simple example. We don't have children components, but we can also pass it to other components as props. Okay, it's just a value. Good. And the set variable, set hidden in this case, we replace the current state with the new one. It will do it asynchronously. I'm not sure if I should say of course or not, but JavaScript is asynchronous in many aspects, and probably, for sure it fits in the React logic, okay, to do this operation asynchronously, and we will talk about this later. And if the value is different, it triggers a re-render of the component, and all its children is a bit generic. All the children that use this state as input in their props, okay? Not really all children, okay? Not because you set a state in a component that you actually need to re-render the whole part of the tree below that state, that component with the state, but it depends on what happens to the props of those components. But let's say in principle, all the children might be affected. Why not the parents? Because the flow of the information is unidirectional, so we have no way of changing values, passing values to parents. We can only pass values to children through props in React. Okay, there is this system of passing values through props that only goes from the parents to the children. Okay. Yes, couple of slides and then we will do a test, okay? Another example, welcome button, English, set English. Use state true, it is English. Okay, return button is English, yes, hello, otherwise ciao, that's Italian for hello, right? Call use state with the initial version of an object or a value that describes the component state. Inside the component, you might refer to the state variable to customize the result according to the current state. Okay? Just JavaScript code. Never, 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 never modify the state variable directly. If you do it, it doesn't work. Okay? You change it for the current execution of the component, but then React doesn't know the state has changed, and so next time the function will be called, it will still have the old value of the state, because you didn't tell React to modify it, okay? All the modifications to the state will be applied asynchronously, not immediately, when React deems it's appropriate. Typically, always after the execution of the function of the component has finished. Okay, because so in this way React can batch all the updates together. It's for efficiency. Also because we don't want to have a code that depends on updates that have not been run and so on. But in general, also for efficiency. Okay, so you need to keep this in mind. Okay, it's not like we do here. Set set state, no, here, set hidden true, and then we expect that hidden is immediately true. No. Next render of the component, hidden will be true. Okay? Okay, good. So let's do a test. Okay? So, Visual Studio Code, right? So, I hope it works. I already tested some stuff, right? So, I think we can still play with the My App. Okay, so open the terminal, just make sure everything works. No, that's a wrong folder, sorry. New terminal, week 07, My App, oops, My App. And you see that we have the node modes and all the stuff, npm run dev. It starts the browser, I mean not the browser, sorry, the web server, and then with, well, you see, you can press H, you see some shortcuts. O opens the browser, so you don't have to type the address, okay, the default browser actually. So that's the example we had, okay. Last lecture. As you see, we have the components, the My Button components. Oh, actually, we already have a hook state, okay? So that's nice. So let's have a look at the code. So the code is in up or button, okay? Up is just very simple. It returns a component, My Button, that has been defined in another file, button.jsx, okay? It passes props language. And so the button takes a props language, okay? And then it defines a state. So this is the state, right? You see the use state that we just saw on the slides. Use state, it's imported from React. So it's a function defined by React. We need to provide an initial value, and that's a good choice, even though it has some side effects that we need to be aware of for later. This is for later, but I mean, it's fine to use what you receive as props as the initial value, okay? So props language, it will be, what's the up? Open to the side, so language n, so props language will be n, the string n, en, and button lang at the beginning, the first time you call the use state, will immediately have the initial value, of course. Otherwise, it's undefined, it becomes a mess in terms of code, right? So, and then if button lang is equal to it, we render this, so we return this. Otherwise, we return the other one. So, in the beginning, the value is n, so we return button. So the classic button of the browser, no React Bootstrap button, and with an event handler with some text inside, hello, and that's actually what you should see, right? Hello. You see the state, n, and hello, that's the content of that button. And you can also see the content here, right? Button, hello, okay? Good. I'm not using this part of the browser, so the developer, the inspector, or the debugger, call it as you like, just to show things to you. It's nice because I can show things to you, but you're free and you're encouraged to use it to debug your applications as well. Okay? And okay, so we want to change the state. We need to have a place where we change this state, right? And what's the typical place where you change the state? Well, for the moment in our application, the only place where it makes sense to do this operation are event handlers, okay? So let's define an event handler. Actually, not too big. This onClick is a property to which we can attach an event handler. That means passing a function to be executed later, passing a callback. Okay? Indeed, you see that we pass a callback because actually we pass a function. It's not like set button lang IT. Okay? That's wrong. Okay? It will be, this is also written in the slides. But why it is wrong? Because, this is a function to be called immediately. Okay? It's a JavaScript expression. JavaScript expression says there is a function, it executes a function. If it says that there is a reference to a function like this, so we are passing actually a function which is defined inside the brackets, and that's possible with the arrow syntax, and that's why the arrow syntax is so useful. In this way, we pass a function to be executed later when the event will happen. Okay? When the event will happen? Well, it will happen when the user will click on the button, right? It's an on-click event waiting for the click event on what? On the button. Okay? So when the user clicks on the button, this function is put into the callback queue of JavaScript. You remember the callback queue, the way in which we execute asynchronous code, right? Put it to the callback queue. Hopefully, there's nothing else going on, so it's immediately put into the stack. The function is called, and the function executes its code. So the function executes only one instruction, set button lang. So it calls this function provided by React before at definition, let's say in the definition phase of the component, and it calls it with a different parameter, the string IT, a fixed string. Okay, so React executes this set button lang. It takes note the fact that you want to change the state of a certain variable, this button lang, to a new value that is IT. Okay, it knows that the old value is n because it's stored somewhere in React's memory. Okay, in JavaScript, but we don't really know where because it's managed by the React library. So it knows the old value is n. It knows you want to have IT as the new value. It checks that the value is different, so it updates the value. So next time you will get button lang with the value IT. And it also writes down and it will execute an update of the component. So it means that it will call again the function myButton because its state has changed. Okay? This happens automatically by React, automatically. You don't have to do anything. That's the powerfulness of React, of these frameworks in general, but we're talking about React, right? So you just update states. The rest is done automatically by React. You define good states, you define UE fragments, so user interface fragment that depends on the state and the props. So when the state changes, the user interface is automatically updated. You remember the difficulties we had when we programmed manually in JavaScript. So you remember that we had create node, append child, and all this stuff, create new nodes, tr, td, etc., etc., etc. That's the problem React wants to solve. You have your information. In this case, it's very simple information, just a string, IT or N. It can be more complex information. Later on in this lecture, we will have more complex information, like a list of things, an array, and so on. You change the array, following some rules, and React will change the user interface automatically. You don't have to write a single line of code. You just need to manage states and props correctly. That's all. The rest is done automatically by React and also efficiently. Okay? So you click, we change the state, IT. React knows it has to re-render the myButton component because its state, the state of myButton has changed. And so it will call myButton again. And so the first thing the code in myButton does is call useState with the default value. But React knows that this state already exists. So the default value, second time, is simply discarded. Okay? The code remains the same, but the default value is simply discarded. And it will return the new value of the state, so IT, sorry, in this case. We clicked on this, so it's IT. And then, again, a function to do the modification for the state for next time. Okay? That's fine. That is probably the same function as before. But actually, we don't know. We don't need to know. I mean, it's a React's task to decide what to do with this function. I mean, we just get a function, we use it. That's all. Okay? And so the rest of the code is executed as before. This time, if button lang equal to IT evaluates to true. And so this time we will get the button from the React Bootstrap, so the nice button, the blue one, and so on, with its attributes and so on, and with another event handler, onClick set button n, so that when we click on that button, and we know that that button is the one which is visible because we made an if, right? Either the first one is visible or the second one, and in this case, we will change again the state to n, and the story starts again, okay? And React will re-render and so on, giving button lang n, yes, and we execute the second part, we render the other button, etc., etc. Okay? Just try if it works. Well, actually, it's so simple that, I mean, if it doesn't work, I don't know what to do, but, I mean, click hello, now we click on the hello, okay? And you see now the DOM, the virtual DOM has changed because we have this my button that has a children, okay, that is the button, the one from React Bootstrap. But actually my button, that's a component that has a state, and the state doesn't move around, okay? It's private to a component, and the state is defined inside my button, so it stays in my button. But now the state is IT, okay? Notice that the props language didn't change, okay? So it's still n, because the code is still the same, right? So this didn't change, right? It's fixed, language n, it's hard-coded in the code, so it will never change, okay? So that's why this value is only good for initializing purposes, so to initialize the state, okay? And you shouldn't use it for anything else, okay? Okay, and then we can click again. There's an event handler, and a different event handler than before, because you see, the code is different. So it's very similar, but the parameter of the set button lang is n, okay? We click again, and we go back to the previous situation, okay? This time we don't have a children here because, I mean, this is only the list of user-defined components, okay? If we want to see the DOM, it's here, but here with the plugin, we can only see the list of user-defined components. So our components app is always present, and then our user-defined component, my button, or you know, button that has been created from React Bootstrap and so on. So all React components, okay? Not just the default components that correspond one-to-one to the HTML ones, okay? So you don't see the P, the div, and all this stuff. Just for simplicity, so it's easier to debug, because in the DOM components that correspond one-to-one to the DOM components, you have nothing to see, right? There are no props and there are no state, and that's why you don't want to see them here. Okay, so props, language n, that's good, state n. So that's how it works. Never modify the state variable directly. Okay, good. And we will see that it will apply, I mean, the set function will apply the modification asynchronously. Of course, this is very simple example, so it looks like it's immediate, right? But, I mean, you cannot really use that value before a new re-render happens, okay? Because in a more complex application for optimization purposes and all the reasons that React has, you might want to wait for updating the state, okay? It doesn't mean that you cannot use the new value. I mean, you simply cannot assume that the button lang value has been already updated with the new value. Okay, you can use the button lang value, but it still has the old value. Okay, even though you already called the set button lang, even though we open a curly bracket here and we write something here, I mean the button lang is still with the old value. Okay, if we want to use the new value, you have to modify your code, assuming that the new value was set correctly and so on. But it has not been set yet. Okay. But I mean, I think you will become familiar quite easily with this behavior. Okay? So, now that we saw the basic example, let's go into more details about some peculiarities that we need to be aware of when we update the state. Okay? So, updating the state means passing a new value to the set variable function. Okay, we saw the set hidden, the set what was it? The set lang, set English, and so on. Okay, of course we can pass a value, very easy. That's what we did until now: true, false, a number, a string. We had the boolean and the string, right? And the new value will simply replace the old one. That's fine. Okay? Very simple example. And for simplicity, especially for the developer, it should have the same type, just for consistency. Otherwise, you don't understand anything after one day. Okay? So, if you have a Boolean, just use Booleans. Otherwise, your code should handle different types and so on. It becomes messy for no reason, right? But it's interesting the fact that you can update the state, so call that set variable function, also passing a function, a reference to a function, okay? A function that takes as a parameter the old value of the state, and it will return the new value of the state to be used by React. Okay? It is executed as a callback, so it's not immediately executed. It is executed when React deems it's time to update the state. Okay? And we said it does it asynchronously, so we don't know when it will happen. This way of updating the state, it's mandatory when the new state depends on the old state. Otherwise, we risk losing some updates. Okay? And I will show you an example. Actually, it's very simple, like a counter. If you have a counter, you need to do +1. If you do the computation immediately, maybe for some reasons, not all the set variables are executed at the correct time and so on. If you do it in the event handler, and you risk having wrong values, okay, if things happen too quickly. If you use a function that depends on your state, React guarantees that all the set variable function that you called will have an effect, okay? So we run the callback in the order in which you called them. And the function return value will replace the current state. Okay? Must return a new state value and must not mutate the passed in state. So you cannot just write all steps equal to something. Actually, it's useless. It's useless like writing props equal to something. It's not used by React. React only cares about the return value of the function that is passed as the callback to update the state. Okay? So there's no point in modifying the value that is passed, so the old state. Okay? And it must return a new state value. This is important. We'll come back to this later this morning. I mean, for values, immediate values that are, primitive values that are strings, booleans, and numbers, that is easy, right? Either they are equal or they are not. Okay, the string is equal or not. But if it is a more complex structure, like an array or an object, it must change the reference to the array or to the object. So it must be a new array or a new object. Okay? That's really important because React checks if the state is the same or not. And it does it with a triple equal, basically. So if the reference is the same, it assumes nothing has changed. Again, for efficiency, if you pass an array with 1 million entries, I mean, that's probably too much, but let's say 1,000 entries, okay? It doesn't go and check all the entries. It just checks, is the reference to the array the same? Yes, so I assume nothing has changed. I don't trigger the re-render. That might be very expensive. If the array reference has changed, okay, I'll go and check all the entries of the array. And again, the entries, are they the same? Okay, good. Are they different? Okay, if there is one that is different, okay, I'll go and re-render, okay? And depending on what we pass and how we use these values and so on, it will check what has to be re-rendered. Okay? We will have examples at the end of these lectures using this more complex structure, in particular arrays, both for the example during the lectures and for the example you have to develop next week during the labs, because you have the array of films, right? And we have the array of answers in our example. Okay, good. So should I use a function or a value in the set variable parameter? Well, I should always use a function, so pass a function when the next state depends on the current state. That's a basic rule, okay? If the new state depends on the old state, you need to pass a function, because you never know when the update will happen, and if you pass a function, React will call this function with the old value of the state and will compute the new value, use the new value, everything will happen correctly in the correct order without skipping any operation and so on. Okay? So let's assume we have a counter, like in the example provided by White in the beginning, but I mean, I think we have another one here, yes. Well, yeah, without the count, but anyway. So let's say we have a counter, right? So we can write something like this, set counter, counter plus 1, okay? So this doesn't lead to any execution error. It's just correct JavaScript code. It could work. Counter is the state variable, right? So counter, set counter equal to use state with the initial value, right? So counter plus 1, nothing wrong, right? But a counter is not guaranteed to be the last value of the set state that might have been called by React, right? So, I mean, let's assume you click quickly, okay, on a button that does +1. And some of the set states, sorry, some of the, some of the set states will be queued by React. So the event handler will run, and you will do set counter with counter plus 1, but counter has not been updated yet by React. So you lose some updates, some +1, okay? And that's why you shouldn't write something like this, because actually you see that the result value, counter plus 1, depends on the previous value of the state, indeed the counter, right? And you should write something like this. You pass a function, count, takes the old value, does +1, and returns the new value, okay? So in this way, React guarantees that all these callbacks will be executed in order and without missing any action, okay? And the calls will be, the callbacks will be called with an up-to-date value of the count of, so it means of the state, okay? So it is guaranteed to have the latest value according to the logic of your program. So you're not missing updates, okay? Okay, note that state changes are usually determined by a synchronous event, so it's important that you recognize this situation, okay? Like before, we wrote code which, I mean, I would say Yeah, it worked because actually what we rendered was coherent with the value of the state, right? But I mean, if we want like a toggle button or something like this, okay, you should write the update in this way because the new value depends on the old one, right? Otherwise, you click and it doesn't update. Okay, not a big deal in this case. Sometimes it happens. You click and you think it didn't get a click. It didn't get the click because you didn't click well. That's one problem. But it didn't get a click because your program is wrong. That's good, right? So any time that the new value depends on the old value, you should write a function here in the set state and not an immediate value. Okay? Even stuff simple like this, right? Take the old value and you just do the not. So I mean, it's a Boolean value, and you do the not, true becomes false, and vice versa. Okay? And so that's a correct way of writing this button in this case, right? So on click, you pass an handler. Remember, you pass an handler. Either you define it immediately, right? Or you just pass a reference to a function. A reference to a function is still possible. It's just JavaScript, right? So you can pass functions around as you like. Toggle language, it's a function. It takes nothing because, I mean, the event handler we will see, I mean, we already saw it, but not in React. It takes the event object, right? But, I mean, here we don't need to use the event object because you just need to use the set of the state and just change the state, right? So, I mean, we don't care about the parameters, and we simply do set of the new state, passing a function that takes the old state and compute the new state. Okay? So that's a way of writing this component. A more compact way is just writing the handler directly here. Okay? That's not so uncommon, especially for very simple event handlers, a very simple state like this, right? Everything is compacted here. Just don't forget the initial open and close brackets, okay? We cannot just write set English, okay? Set English, it's immediately called. That's wrong, right? If it happens in the lab, you call us, and you will see that. I think quickly identify the issue. I think there is a warning by React as well because calling the set state directly inside the rendering phase is not good. Okay, so it gives you at least a warning, if not an error. Okay? Instead, the correct behavior is to have the state updates happen in event handler as asynchronous events. Okay? And so it makes natural that the state updates are asynchronous operations. Okay, so set English E, the arrow exclamation mark E. Okay? Often implemented as an arrow function. Okay, that's good. Okay? Just beware of the bug, right? So, as I told you, if you write like this, you pass a reference to a function, so you don't execute the function immediately. If you pass something like this, it's a JavaScript expression, it's immediately evaluated, so the set function is immediately called. Okay? And there is a very cryptic error message in the console if they didn't change it. Cannot update a component by rendering a different component to locate the best state set call, blah, blah, blah. Okay? And so it's not so immediate to understand that actually you have passed, you wanted to pass the result value of the set state, which actually I think it's undefined or something like this. I'm not sure what it returns because React doesn't tell us because we don't need it, okay? And you should pass a callback that then calls the state update function, okay? Okay, so I think we have some examples, right? But let me finish the discussion here, okay? The default value. So we talked about what to pass as a parameter, right, in the set state function. But then we have the use state and we have this initial value, right? And we say, okay, you pass the initial value, that's fine. it's used only during the first render of the component, only during the first render. Never used in successive renders. I told you before, right? So it was here, right? I think. Use state true. First time we use true and we put into hidden. Next times, simply ignore it. Okay? Or it was, no, it was in Visual Studio Code, right? So, first time, the props language value is put into the button lang. Next time, simply ignore it. Okay? You can change it, you can change the props, that's fine. React will re-render the component, but will not use this value, even if it has changed, to update the state. Okay? So this is just the initial value. And that's the problem, because it might lead to confusion. You think, well, I updated props language from the other component, right? From up. I write it here, right? I think the state should change. It doesn't work this way. Okay? If you want something like this to happen, you have to rewrite the component in a different way. Okay? We have no way of addressing this issue at the moment here. But if you want to do something like this, probably that's an indication that you should change the place where you have the state. Okay? If you want something to change, depending on the fact that you change something here in the props, and you want to change something in the children, you probably want to pass props and use props and have the state inside up and not inside the my button. Okay? Otherwise, this is just the initial value, and that's correct. Okay? Just the initial value. And if you want to use this initial value again, you have to destroy the my button component and recreate the my button component. Okay? That's a topic for next lectures. Okay? Okay, so I'm telling this to you because it's one of the most common errors that you might do when thinking in terms of this initial value. Well, I changed the initial value. So I use it as props dot something. I change the props. Why the state doesn't update? State doesn't update because it's just used when the state is created, not when things change and you pass a new value to the initialization, because the initialization only happens at the beginning when the component is created. Okay? So it comes into existence. Of course, now we don't know exactly when the components are destroyed, are recreated, and so on. That's the topic for the life cycle of the components. It is later on during the course. Okay? But at the moment, let's stick with something simple. The components start to exist when you return it with the JSX syntax. Okay? There is a component is not existing, it's created by React. Okay? This value may be an immediate value, so something like a string, boolean, number, array, object, or even a function. But again, this function is not called again. It's just for convenience. If it's a function, React recognizes it's a function, it gets the return value of the function, so it immediately runs the function, gets the return value, and simply use this return value as the initial value. Okay? I must tell you, I didn't see any case in which during the exam, but also in actual applications, simple applications, there is any need to use a function as an initialization value. Okay? Because you cannot initialize a state with the function. Okay? It's useless because putting a reference to a function in a component, in a state, in a component, is basically useless. Okay? So if you pass a function, the function is executed and the return value is used as the initial value. Okay? But I mean, not so common. Okay? Just beware of the fact that you might have bugs. Okay? So just pass normal value. Booleans, numbers, strings, arrays, and objects. Okay? They may be computed from the props as we saw during the example, but it will not update if the prop changes. Beware of potential bugs. And in general, it's not recommended, or I would say this is a weak recommendation. In general, not recommended, or you can do it, but be careful when doing it, okay, as in the example. So, of course, in the beginning, you need to initialize things, so that's fine. We have a my button. It shows a button, can be English or Italian. and you want to decide how it starts, that's fine. Let's pass a prop and say how it starts. So it's fine to use it as the initial value. But this is just the initial value. As long as the button, the My button exists in the virtual DOM, the initial value is not used anymore. You want to pass another initial value, it's not possible. Okay? You need to change the logic, as I told you. You need to move the state in another component and pass it as a prop, use the props for rendering and all these things, but you cannot change the initialization. Just be aware of this. Okay? Okay, so yeah, still 3 slides. Then I think we can have a break, and then we will have a look at the example. So I prepared the example. So more complex examples. A counter, well, actually the counter, we already saw the counter, right? Count, set count, and we saw that you need to use the old value, previous count, plus 1, minus 1. Let's assume we have 3 buttons, plus, minus, or also reset, okay? So if you have a value that does not depend on the old ones, that's fine to use the value, right? Props initial count, reset button, that's fine. No problem, right? It doesn't depend on the old value. Whatever the value is, we don't care. We just set a new value, 0, 1, 3, whatever you want. And this can come from props as well. I mean, it's just a JavaScript value, okay? Just be aware of the fact that this prop will never change, okay? Unless it's changed by the one that creates a counter, okay? What's the difference between this initialization and this one? I mean, this one is the initialization of the state. So it happens only the first time the state is created when the component is created, counter. Here, this is an event handler. So this operation will happen every time the user clicks on reset button, okay? Because it's an event handler. When the event happens, the event handlers runs, okay? So every time the user clicks on reset, this set count props initial count is run, okay? But initial count is always the same value, okay? When you press on the plus and minus button, you will use the old value, you do plus 1, minus 1, and you set a new value, and React knows that the state has changed, as when you press on the reset. If the state has changed, it calls the function count again, and so it re-renders the user interface fragment, so it returns something which has been updated, in particular with the new value of count, okay? And that's all for this example. One additional piece of information, and then we stop for the break. We can use useState more than once in the same component. So until now, I only show you one useState in one component, right? But luckily, with the hooks, you can use the useState as many times as you like, okay? Because sometimes you have different states in the same component. Like here, you see there is a hidden state, so we need to hide something in the component, that's possible, plus we have a counter. So there's something that has to be hidden, or maybe the counter has to be hidden or not, I don't know. I don't know what we are going to do with these states, but there is a state that decides if something is hidden or not, there is a counter, a mode, whatever you want, okay? You don't have to merge all these states into a single state. You can use multiple useState calls to React, and React can handle more than one state for the same component. That's great, by the way, because all class components could not do this. They only had this state variable. It was really messy programming with this system, because if you have to merge all the states into a single one, you have to create an object with keys, attributes, values, and so on. Every time you update the state, you need to create a new reference to the object, and so on. So it's a lot of code, a lot of potential errors that can happen. And that's why probably, but I would say almost certainly, hooks became so popular, because it's so simple to use. useState, and there is a state. Another independent state, another useState. So simple, okay? No need to merge everything together. By the way, this is the recommended way to proceed with creating states in components, in React components. Create as many state variables as needed, and they are all independent. And even if just one of them changes, React will trigger the re-render of the component. Okay, so you don't have to tell React, well, one of them has changed. React detects it. So one has changed, two have changed, no problem. If something has changed, React will trigger the re-render of the component. Okay, so that's good. And of course, I mean, how do we decide what to put inside a single useState call? Well, just put some state that is independent from the other states. But if you have more complex content like the list of answers, the list of films as in the lab and so on, they should be in a single state because it's an array, right? You cannot just split each item of the array in a single state, in a single use state call, because you don't know how many use states you have, right? So sometimes you have to have more complex values like arrays and objects in a single state. But if you have like the list of films and the list of art directors and so on, you can have two states with two different arrays. Much better, much easier to handle. And you trigger re-renders only if something changes, and maybe just a part of the application that needs to be re-rendered because it depends only on one state and not the other, and so on. Okay? So, messages here, you can use as many use states as you like, okay? And actually use a use state for each independent state that the component can have, okay? So independent means you don't have to change information in other states if something changes in one, okay? Like hidden here is independent from the count, which is independent from the mode, okay? Good. So we will see this example after the break, okay? Because this takes us to another big issue that we have with the state. So we have a state in a component, it's private to the component. What if we need to change the state from another component? That's a problem, right? Because the state is available only in a certain component, the component where you define the use state, okay? What you call the use state, actually. Okay, but let's have a break. I mean, we already had a lot of concept this morning in this lecture. So I will do 10 minutes break unless you have questions. No questions, right? And so let's break for 10 minutes, and then we will finish the discussion about the state and see some examples.